Big Shaq, NBA legend, a man simply enjoying his own backyard. But when his neighbor saw him swimming, she didn't see a homeowner. She saw a threat. One false 911 call later, flashing lights and sirens turned his peaceful day into a nightmare. But what happened next? No one saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Miami sun cast its golden glow over the pristine neighborhood of Palmcrest Hills. It was the kind of place where the air smelled like freshly mowed lawns and expensive cologne, where every house looked like it had been plucked straight from the pages of a luxury magazine. Towering palm trees lined the clean streets, their long shadows stretching lazily across perfectly paved sidewalks. The occasional hum of a sports car engine or the faint sound of a backyard fountain added to the ambiance of quiet, effortless wealth. But for Shaquille O'Neal, better known as Big Shaq, this was just home. Shaq had always been larger than life, not just in stature but in spirit. He was a man who carried his success with grace, never letting his millions, or his legendary basketball career, turn him into something he wasn't. Despite his fame, he lived by simple principles: kindness, humility, and the firm belief that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't shared. That's why, on most afternoons, you wouldn't find him in some exclusive club or surrounded by Hollywood elites. Instead, he'd be right here, in his backyard, in the very pool he had designed to be his oasis, a place of peace in a world that sometimes refused to see him as just another man. Today was no different. The cool water rippled around him as he floated effortlessly, eyes closed, letting the heat of the sun warm his face. He had always loved the water. There was something about the way it embraced him, made him feel weightless, free. The faint laughter of children playing nearby drifted through the air, mixing with the soft rustling of palm leaves in the breeze. Not far from his pool, his longtime friend and house manager Derek lounged on a patio chair, sipping lemonade and scrolling through his phone. "Shaq, man, you ever gonna get out of that water? You've been in there longer than a dolphin." Shaq cracked one eye open and grinned. "A dolphin, huh? You just mad 'cause you can't float like this?" Derek scoffed. "Ain't nobody trying to float, big man. Some of us gotta work." Shaq laughed, sending gentle ripples across the pool's surface. This was his paradise, his escape from the noise of the world. But paradise never lasted forever. Across the street, behind a wall of tall hedges and an iron-wrought fence, someone was watching. Eleanor Whitmore had lived in Palmcrest Hills for over 20 years. She had the kind of wealth that wasn't flashy but deeply ingrained. Old money, inherited through generations of privilege. With silver-streaked hair styled to perfection and a wardrobe that screamed class, she was the self-appointed gatekeeper of the neighborhood's standards. And to Eleanor, Shaquille O'Neal was a problem. She had never liked the idea of him living here. Sure, he was rich, richer than most of the people in Palmcrest Hills. But there was something about him that unsettled her. He was too visible, too big, too loud, too friendly with people who didn't belong in a place like this. He let local kids into his home, treated them like family, and had the audacity to enjoy his life right in front of her. It wasn't right. It wasn't the kind of presence she wanted in her peaceful, elite world. And today, as she peeked through her curtains and watched him lounging in his pool, something in her snapped. Eleanor turned away from the window, her lips pressed into a thin line. She picked up her phone and tapped a familiar number. "Hello, Palmcrest Hills Security? Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious." Shaq had just stepped out of the pool when Derek's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Huh, looks like security's on their way over here." Shaq reached for a towel, rubbing the water from his face. "Security? For what?" "No idea, man. Said they got a report of suspicious activity at your house." Derek's voice was laced with irritation. "Suspicious? What, you swimming too loud?" Shaq chuckled, but there was something behind his eyes. Something Derek recognized. He had seen it before. That quiet understanding. That familiar exhaustion of a black man who had lived through these moments too many times before. Minutes later, 2 security officers stepped through the open gate. Both wore neatly pressed uniforms, their expressions unreadable, but professional. "Mr. O'Neill," one of them said, nodding. "Apologies for the interruption, but we received a call about some concerns regarding unauthorized activity on this property." Shaq leaned against the pool's edge, arms crossed. "Uh-huh. And what exactly was the concern?" The officers exchanged glances. One cleared his throat. The caller mentioned seeing a large man in the backyard, possibly trespassing. Silence stretched between them. Derek scoffed, shaking his head. "You gotta be kidding me." Shaq let out a slow breath. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He had dealt with things like this before, knew how quickly they could escalate. Instead, he gestured around him. "So let me get this straight. Someone called you because I was swimming in my own pool?" One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we do have to respond to all reports, sir." Shaq studied them for a long moment before nodding. "All right, you've responded. You see me? You know I live here. So, we good?" The officers hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. We're good. Sorry for the trouble." As they turned to leave, Derek muttered, "Yeah, you real sorry." Shaq grabbed his towel and sighed. He wanted to let it go, to shake it off like he always did. But something told him this wasn't over. Across the street, behind her pristine white curtains, Eleanor watched as the security officers walked away, her jaw tight with frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She turned back to her phone, this time dialing a different number. 911. "What's your emergency?" Her voice was steady, laced with practiced concern. "Yes, I need to report a trespasser. There's a very large man acting aggressively in my neighbor's backyard. I'm scared. Please send someone quickly." As she hung up, a slow, satisfied smile crept across her lips. This time, she thought, they'll take it seriously. And just like that, the peaceful afternoon in Palm Crest Hills shattered. The late afternoon sun shimmered over Palm Crest Hills, painting the sky with hues of gold and amber. A soft breeze rustled through the neatly trimmed hedges, carrying with it the distant sound of a lawnmower and the occasional bark of a pampered dog. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever seemed out of place, where order, wealth, and exclusivity wrapped around its residents like an invisible shield. Eleanor Whitmore stood by her second-floor window, her manicured fingers tightening around a chilled glass of white wine. She had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know when something didn't belong. And right now, Shaquille O'Neal lounging in his own backyard was, in her mind, exactly that. She had been watching him for a while now, too long, perhaps. The way he floated effortlessly in his oversized pool, completely at ease, completely comfortable, as if he had every right to be there. Which, of course, he did. But that wasn't the point. Her lips pursed as she took another sip of wine. She had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it wasn't a big deal. But the more she watched, the more unsettled she felt. He was too large, too noticeable. It wasn't that she was racist, at least that's what she told herself, but Palm Crest Hills was supposed to have a certain atmosphere, a refined sense of exclusivity. And no matter how much money Shaquille O'Neal had, no matter how many celebrity friends or charitable events he attended, he didn't fit in her version of this neighborhood. Then, as if to push her over the edge, she saw something that made her stomach twist. Two neighborhood kids, probably no older than 12, walked by Shaq's open gate. He spotted them and waved, flashing that big, familiar smile. And then, he invited them in. Eleanor's grip tightened around her glass. That was it. That was the moment. Without another thought, she turned, grabbed her phone from the marble countertop, and dialed 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Eleanor took a breath, injecting just the right amount of worry into her tone. "Yes, I need to report a trespasser." There was a brief pause. "Where is the trespasser located?" "In my neighbor's backyard," she said, glancing back out the window. "There's a very large man, huge actually, acting aggressively near the pool. I don't know who he is. He's scaring me." The dispatcher's voice remained neutral. "Ma'am, is the individual armed?" Eleanor hesitated. I don't know. But he looks dangerous. He's towering over these children, and I just don't feel safe. Please, send someone quickly." "Can you describe the individual?" Eleanor exhaled sharply, as if the very thought of him was unsettling. Yes, he's black, extremely tall, muscular. I'd say over 7 feet. He's acting like he owns the place. She heard the way the dispatcher's tone shifted, just slightly. More alert, more serious. That was all she needed. Officers are on their way, the dispatcher confirmed. Eleanor smiled, a small, satisfied curve of her lips. She didn't need to say much. The words she had already spoken would do all the work for her. In the backyard, Shaq was still floating in the pool, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond his peaceful retreat. The cool water lapped at his broad shoulders as he tilted his head back, soaking in the warmth of the Miami sun. Yo, Shaq, you really gonna spend the whole afternoon in there? Derek called from the patio, setting down his phone. Shaq opened one eye, smirking. You say that like it's a bad thing. Derek chuckled. Nah, man. I just don't get how you don't turn into a raisin by now. Shaq let out a deep laugh, shaking his head. This was what he lived for. Simple moments, good friends, the ability to just be. The 2 neighborhood kids he had waved at earlier, Jake and Oliver, had stopped by the fence. Shaq, always welcoming, had invited them in. They'd played a few rounds of basketball the other day, and Shaq had promised to show them how to do a proper hook shot. You guys want to see something cool? He called, already pushing himself up to the edge of the pool. Yeah. Oliver's face lit up. Shaq stood towering over them as he stretched. All right, check this out. He took a few steps back, then ran forward, launching himself into the water with a perfect cannonball, sending a massive splash their way. The boys erupted into laughter, clapping and cheering. Shaq grinned as he surfaced. Told you I still got it. What he didn't see, what none of them saw, was the line of police cars speeding down the street, their sirens blaring. Inside the police dispatch room, the 911 call had been flagged as urgent. A large, unidentified black man described as aggressive and potentially dangerous in an upscale neighborhood. That wasn't the kind of call that got second-guessed. The officers had been briefed quickly, just enough details to make them believe this was a serious situation. And now, as they pulled up outside Shaq's estate, their hands instinctively rested near their belts, eyes scanning for a potential threat. Perimeter looks clear, one officer murmured into his radio. The lead officer, Sergeant Whitman, stepped forward, narrowing his eyes at the scene before him. A massive man in swim trunks, 2 kids standing nearby. Laughter, no visible signs of distress. He frowned. Something didn't feel right. The other officers, however, were already moving in. Sir, one of them called out, his voice sharp. Step away from the children. Now! Shaq blinked, his relaxed expression shifting to one of confusion. He turned to Derek, as if checking whether he had just imagined that. Derek was already on his feet, his jaw tight. Man, what the hell is this? Shaq slowly raised his hands, not out of fear, but because he knew exactly how this looked. I live here, he said calmly. The officers exchanged glances. One kept his hand near his radio, another adjusted his stance. The moment stretched, thick with tension. From her window, Eleanor watched, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with anticipation. This was exactly what she had wanted. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, cutting through the tension. Units on scene. Be advised. Property records confirm this is the homeowner, Shaquille O'Neal. The officers hesitated. The weight of their assumption hung in the air. Shaq let out a slow breath, his arms still raised. Y'all good now? Silence. Sergeant Whitman, still frowning, finally stepped forward. Mr. O'Neal, we received a report about suspicious activity. We had to respond accordingly. Shaq's eyes met his. There was something unspoken there, an understanding, an exhaustion. Suspicious, Shaq repeated, his voice steady but edged with something deeper. Because I was swimming in my own pool? Derek scoffed. Man, this is some bull... Shaq held up a hand, stopping him. Not because Derek was wrong, but because he knew anger wouldn't fix this. Sergeant Whitman exhaled. We'll update our records to avoid this happening again. Shaq nodded once, his face unreadable. Yeah, you do that. The officers turned back toward their cars, the moment slipping away, dissolving into the hot Miami air. From across the street, Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. It wasn't enough. She turned back to her phone. She still had one more call to make. The first wail of sirens shattered the calm afternoon. The peaceful ambiance of Palm Crest Hills, the gentle rustling of palm trees, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the occasional laughter of children, was drowned beneath the piercing sound of urgency. Then came the flashing lights. From his backyard, Shaq barely had time to process what was happening before 3 black and white squad cars came screeching to a stop outside his estate. Within seconds, uniformed officers poured out, their hands hovering near their belts, scanning the area like they had just arrived at a high-stakes crime scene. Shaq wiped his face with a towel, squinting against the blinding red and blue reflections bouncing off his house's glass doors. His first thought was that someone else in the neighborhood must have been in trouble. A burglary? A medical emergency? But then he noticed where they were looking, straight at him. Derek, who had been lounging on the patio just moments ago, shot to his feet. What the hell is this? Shaq remained calm, but his body tensed. The officers moved with urgency, spreading out like they were surrounding a suspect. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped forward, his hand still dangerously close to his holster. "You! Step away from the pool, sir," the officer barked. Shaq blinked. "Excuse me?" "Step away from the pool now." The weight of the situation settled onto Shaq's shoulders, heavy and familiar. He knew this drill. It didn't matter that he was a household name. It didn't matter that his face had graced billboards and TV screens for decades. Right now, to them, he was just a large black man who somehow looked out of place in his own home. He took a slow breath, keeping his movements deliberate. "All right," he said evenly, stepping out of the water and grabbing his towel. "Mind telling me what this is about?" "Hands where we can see them," another officer demanded. Shaq exhaled, more annoyed than angry. He spread his hands out, palms facing forward. "Like this?" Derek stepped forward, but Shaq shot him a look that said, "Not yet." The officers exchanged glances. One of them, a younger cop with sharp eyes and a rigid stance, spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, we have visual on the suspect. Proceeding with caution." "Suspect." Shaq shook his head, letting out a low, humorless chuckle. "Man, y'all serious?" The lead officer, Sergeant Whitman, narrowed his eyes. "We received a report about a trespasser on this property, a large male acting aggressively toward children." At those words, Shaq's easy demeanor shifted. His eyes darkened, his jaw clenched. Acting aggressively toward children? He looked over at Jake and Oliver, who were still standing by the fence, wide-eyed and confused. Derek scoffed loudly. "Oh, you gotta be kidding me. This is why y'all rolled up like this? 'Cause Shaq was teaching some kids how to hoop?" The officers didn't waver. Their stance, their unreadable expressions, their refusal to lower their guard. It was all too familiar. They had already decided Shaq was a problem before they even arrived. And then, from across the street, came the final act of the performance. Eleanor Whitmore, dressed in a crisp white blouse and beige linen slacks, stepped out onto her porch. She clutched her chest dramatically, as if the mere presence of Shaq was too much for her fragile senses to handle. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she cried out, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "I was so scared. I saw him jumping into the pool, shouting, and then those poor children." She turned her wide, teary eyes to the officers. "I just knew something terrible was about to happen." Derek's mouth fell open. Man, this woman should win a damn Oscar. Shaq remained silent, studying Eleanor with the kind of look that could melt steel. She wasn't scared. She was in control, and she knew exactly what she was doing. One of the officers turned toward her. "Ma'am, are you saying this man was threatening these children?" Eleanor hesitated just for a second, just enough to plant the seed of doubt. Then she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I think so. I mean, look at him. He's so big." Shaq closed his eyes briefly. There it was. Not that he had done anything, not that he had said anything, just the size of him. That was enough to make her feel threatened. The officers stiffened. That one small, loaded comment had shifted the air completely. Derek took a step forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "Okay, this is straight-up nonsense. First of all, Shaq lives here. Second, those kids aren't in danger, they were having fun. And third, he turned toward the kids, his voice softer. Jake, Oliver, tell them what really happened. The boys looked at each other, then at the officers. Jake, the older of the two, swallowed nervously. Mr. O'Neill wasn't doing anything bad. He was just showing us how to play. Oliver nodded quickly. Yeah, he even did a cannonball. It was awesome. The officers glanced at one another. The lead cop's stance relaxed slightly, but the tension was still there. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. Look, officers, we all know what's going on here. Some lady sees a black man enjoying his own property, and suddenly, I'm a threat. You can check the property records, check the security footage. Hell, check your own common sense. But let's stop pretending this is anything more than what it is. Ben's face reddened. That's not what I meant. Shaq exhaled through his nose. Look, man, I get it. Y'all want to smooth this over, make it seem like it was just some mix-up. But let's be real. If I was white, none of this would have happened. Laura looked away, guilt flashing across her face. Shaq sighed. I ain't mad at y'all, but I see where you stand. Ben opened his mouth, then closed it, unable to argue. Then, from the back of the group, a familiar voice spoke up. I remember when she tried to get you banned from the HOA meetings. Shaq turned, surprised to see Lisa Caldwell. Lisa was a long-time resident, one of the few people in Palmcrest Hills who had always been vocal about fairness. She stepped forward, arms crossed. None of this is new, she continued. Eleanor's been on this for years. Y'all just chose to ignore it. Margaret frowned. Lisa, don't. No, let's talk about it. Lisa cut her off. Who remembers when Eleanor fought against letting Shaq host the community charity event? A few people shuffled uncomfortably. She said it would bring in the wrong crowd, Lisa added, her tone sharp. Margaret sighed. Lisa, we all know Eleanor has her views, but we can't just attack her. Lisa scoffed. Attack her? Are you serious? Shaq just got treated like a criminal in his own home and you're worried about Eleanor's feelings? Derek whistled low. She's spitting facts, though. Lisa turned back to Shaq, her eyes softening. I'm sorry it took something this big for people to see it. But I see you, and I appreciate you. Shaq nodded, finally feeling some semblance of relief. Across the street, Eleanor watched from her window. She could see the way the neighborhood had gathered, the way some of them were turning on her. It burned. Her husband, Richard, stood behind her, arms crossed. I told you this was a mistake. Eleanor huffed, gripping the curtain tighter. I was trying to protect the neighborhood. Richard let out a tired sigh. From what, Eleanor? A man swimming? She turned, her face still tight with defiance. He doesn't belong here. Richard's expression darkened. No, Eleanor. You don't belong here anymore. Eleanor's stomach twisted. For the first time, she realized she had lost. Back outside, the crowd was dispersing. Some neighbors patted Shaq on the shoulder, offering words of support. Others left in silence, their own prejudices quietly exposed. Shaq turned to Derek. Man, I really thought I was accepted here. Derek gave him a look. Shaq, they accepted what you could do for them, not who you are. That truth settled deep. Lisa, still standing nearby, offered a small smile. The people who matter see you, Shaq. And the ones who don't? They were never worth your time anyway. Shaq took a deep breath, looking around at what was left of the gathering. The neighborhood hadn't changed overnight. It never would. But now, at least, the truth was out. And that was a start. It started with a single video. A neighbor, a young tech-savvy guy named Jordan, had recorded the entire confrontation on his phone. From the moment the police arrived, to Eleanor's exaggerated performance, to the security footage proving Shaq's innocence. It was all captured in high definition. Jordan wasn't particularly close to Shaq, but he knew injustice when he saw it. And he knew that, in today's world, exposing the truth wasn't just a choice, it was a responsibility. So he uploaded it. And the internet did the rest. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had hit 1 million views. By morning, it was trending across every major platform: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. The captions varied, but the message was the same. Karen calls cops on Shaq for swimming in his own pool. Even Shaquille O'Neal isn't safe from racial profiling. She tried to lie. The receipts don't lie. By the next afternoon, it had hit national news. The media frenzy outside Shaq's mansion was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. News vans lined the street. Reporters with microphones and cameras vied for the best shot of his front gate. Mr. O'Neal, can you comment on the false police report? Shaq, are you planning on taking legal action? Do you feel unsafe in your own home now? Derek peeked out through the blinds and let out a low whistle. Man, you'd think this was the damn Super Bowl. Shaq sat on his couch, scrolling through his phone. He wasn't surprised by the reaction. He had lived in the public eye for decades. But this wasn't about basketball. This wasn't about celebrity gossip. This was about something deeper. Daniel Langford, his lawyer, sat across from him, reviewing his notes. They want a statement. Shaq sighed, leaning back. I know. Daniel set his pen down. You should press charges. Shaq rubbed a hand over his face. I don't know, man. Daniel frowned. Shaq, this woman called the cops on you. Lied. Put you in danger. If you weren't you, if there weren't cameras, this could have gone very differently. Shaq knew he was right. They both did. But something about it didn't sit right. He wasn't the kind of man to go out looking for revenge. But at the same time, how many times had this happened to someone who didn't have his influence, his wealth, his platform? Derek tossed his phone onto the couch. The internet's going crazy, man. Half of them are saying you need to sue the hell out of her, and the other half are saying, oh, poor Eleanor, she just made a mistake. He rolled his eyes. Same damn story, different day. Shaq sighed. Yeah, that's the problem. The world had seen what happened. Now he had to decide what to do with it. Meanwhile, Eleanor Whitmore's life was falling apart. She had never been a social media person, but now she was everywhere. Old videos surfaced, complaints from former neighbors, screenshots of HOA emails she had sent over the years, subtly pushing for exclusivity in the neighborhood. It turned out this wasn't her first time. She had reported a black teenager for walking too slowly down the sidewalk, had called security on a Latino landscaper because he didn't look like he belonged. People who once ignored her behavior were now forced to confront it. Some neighbors distanced themselves immediately. Others, the ones who had quietly agreed with her before, stood by her, claiming she was the real victim. The debate raged on, but one thing was clear. Eleanor Whitmore was finished. Shaq sat on his back patio, staring at the pool where it had all started. He could take the easy route. He could sue, win, make an example out of Eleanor. The internet would love that. But then what? Would she learn? Would people like her ever learn? Probably not. Shaq leaned forward, clasping his hands together. I don't want to fight her in court. Daniel raised a brow. Okay. So what's your move? A slow grin spread across Shaq's face. I'm gonna buy her house. Derek nearly choked on his drink. Wait, what? Shaq sat back. She doesn't want me in this neighborhood? Cool. Then she can leave. Daniel smirked, catching on. You want to make her uncomfortable in the same way she tried to make you uncomfortable. Shaq nodded. Exactly. Derek laughed, shaking his head. Damn, that's cold. Shaq grinned. Nah, that's justice. The offer was made by the end of the week. It wasn't public, wasn't flashy. But Eleanor got the message loud and clear. She fought back, tried to rally support, claimed Shaq was trying to intimidate her, that he was forcing her out. But no one cared. The same people who once whispered in agreement with her now wanted nothing to do with her. The neighborhood had changed, and she wasn't part of it anymore. She sold the house, and just like that, Eleanor Whitmore was gone. The news hit the media like an earthquake. Shaq just bought the house of the woman who called the cops on him. Big Shaq, bigger revenge, the ultimate power move. He could have sued. Instead, he did this. Some called him a genius. Some called him petty. Shaq didn't care. This wasn't about Eleanor. This was about sending a message. A month later, the house was renovated. The gates were open. The community was invited. Shaq turned Eleanor's former home into something bigger than her small-mindedness. A community center. A safe space for local kids. A place for learning, growth, opportunity. Reporters asked him why he did it. His answer was simple. Because hate doesn't build anything, but I do. And just like that, Shaq turned a moment of injustice into a movement. The sun dipped low over Palmcrest Hills, casting a warm, golden glow across the manicured lawns and towering palm trees. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, pristine, wealthy, untouched by the outside world. But it wasn't the same. Shaq stood on the balcony of his newly acquired house, Eleanor's former home, watching as the last of the renovation crews packed up. The house no longer bore any trace of her. The cold, impersonal decor had been stripped away, replaced with warm tones, vibrant artwork, and an open-door policy. The space had been reborn. Yet, despite the victory, something still lingered inside him. Derek sat on the outdoor couch, sipping a soda, scrolling through his phone. Man, they still talking about this. Shaq glanced at him. What now? Derek held up the screen. Tweets, articles, videos. The internet hadn't let the story die. People were still debating, arguing, dissecting. Shaq made his point, but did he have to go that far? Eleanor deserved worse. He let her off easy. This whole thing proves racism is still alive and well. Shaq sighed. People are gonna say what they say. Derek leaned forward. Yeah, but here's what you say. What you think. Because this whole thing, it ain't just about one racist woman. It's about the fact that even you, with all your money, your fame, your influence, ain't safe from this shit. Shaq stared off into the distance. Derek wasn't wrong. He had spent years believing he had transcended race in some way, that his success had insulated him, that people saw him as Shaquille O'Neal, the legend. But that night by the pool, none of it had mattered. The next day, a knock came at the gate. Lisa Caldwell stood there, looking hesitant. Behind her were a handful of neighbors, Ben and Laura, Margaret, even Jordan, the guy who had filmed everything. Shaq stepped out, nodding. Y'all good? Lisa spoke first. Shaq, we need to talk. The group shifted awkwardly. It was clear they had been wrestling with something. Margaret finally spoke. I owe you an apology. Her voice was quieter than usual. I defended Eleanor because I didn't want to believe that someone in our community could be like that. But the truth is, I've ignored things like this before, looked the other way. And I think a lot of us have. Shaq studied her. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't trying to absolve herself. She was just telling the truth. Ben ran a hand through his hair. It's easy to pretend racism isn't a problem when it doesn't personally affect you. But this whole thing, it woke us up. You shouldn't have had to prove yourself to us. You shouldn't have had to prove you belong. And I'm sorry for that. Lisa folded her arms. Some of us knew what Eleanor was and we didn't stop her. That makes us complicit. Shaq let their words settle. This was more than he had expected. Finally, he nodded. Accountability's a start. What y'all gonna do about it? The group exchanged glances. Laura spoke up. That community center you're building, we want to help. Shaq's lips curved into a slow smile. That was all he needed to hear. Meanwhile, Eleanor Whitmore's life had crumbled. After selling her house, she moved out of Palmcrest Hills, but she couldn't escape the consequences. The internet never forgot. Every job application was met with side eyes. Old friends stopped returning calls. Even her own family distanced themselves. She wasn't a victim, she wasn't in danger, but she had become irrelevant. And that was a fate she couldn't stand. Shaq didn't think about her much anymore. He had bigger things to focus on. Because now it was time to build. Not physically, the houses were still immaculate, the streets still quiet, the same luxury cars parked in the same driveways. But the energy had changed. The new Eleanor Whitmore house wasn't just a name on a building. It was a symbol. The once exclusive neighborhood now hosted mentorship programs, after-school activities, workshops on racial bias. The gates that once divided the rich from the rest of the world were opened. And Shaq? He thrived. One evening, he stood by the pool, watching the sun dip below the skyline. The same spot where it had all started. Derek walked up, hands in his pockets. "You ever think about how wild this all was?" Shaq smirked. "Every damn day." Derek chuckled. "You did something big, man. You changed things." Shaq exhaled, looking at the rippling water. "I didn't do it alone." Derek nodded, then smirked. "You still swimming loud as hell, though?" Shaq laughed, shaking his head. "Damn right I am." He turned, walked toward the pool, and with a massive splash, dove in. Because this was his home. And he was finally, fully at peace. Racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides behind concern and misunderstandings. Shaq's story is just one example of what happens every day to people without fame, cameras, or power to fight back. So, what would you do in his shoes? How would you respond if it happened in your neighborhood? Join the conversation, share this story, speak up when it matters. Because change starts when we stop looking away